One of the great goals of the church from the very beginning of America has been to Christianize and to convert the natives or the indigenous folks that were living here and the Africans who are brought here. In many of the old church documents, the indigenous people are referred to as salvages, S-A-L-V-E-D-G-E-S. They are something which can be saved. The wording of the church is interesting in that it talks about bringing those yet living in darkness out of the arms of the devil, which is a very politically incorrect thing to say about Native religion, but in the colonial period, most people believed that the one true church was the only right church and that everybody needed to be converted. So the Roman Catholics convert, the Anglicans convert. People were of a mind that they needed to be converted. So when they land here, converting the people that were already living here was part of their goal. Now, the English tend to do this at the point of the mind. So they tend to teach the Bible. They tend to teach the commandments and the Lord's Prayer and the Apostles' Creed. Part of the Charter of 1619 includes plans for a college and a school. These are called Henricus College, and they were to be in what we now call Henrico County, up near Richmond. Eventually, we have the College of William and Mary, and there was an Indian school there called the Brafferton. This is where they brought children from the tribes to convert them, make them wear English clothes, eat English food, learn English words, and behave like proper, civilized English people. It was hoped that they would return as Christian missionaries to their homelands. This was not often accomplished, and Brafferton students, such as John Montour, acted as cultural go-betweens for their people. They could read the treaties and other agreements, for example, and advise their people about armed conflicts, such as the American Revolution, and which side might be the more advantageous ally. In 1775, a census of Williamsburg published in the Virginia Almanac showed that 52% of the 1,880 people in Williamsburg were black, most of them enslaved. Most of them were domestics, such as cooks, body servants for the master and mistress of the household, and such. Others worked in the trade shops, doing some of the heavy work. Most of the folks in town who were enslaved would be domestic. They would be very high caliber house servants, cooks, and people who really could run the house. We don't have a lot of people who have been chopping tobacco, feeding pigs, although there is some evidence that a slave could be sent to his owner's plantation outside of town as a means of punishment. So the hierarchy within the white society is mirrored in the African society. Everybody is a piece of the puzzle. So the enslaved people in Williamsburg are going to be everybody from the one who tends to the horses to the one who opens your front door and greets the very elegant guests you have chosen to invite. Some of them are housekeeping people. Some of them are craftspeople. And there were a few in Williamsburg who were free African Virginians. Just a few, but there were some who were free. In the church records, we have many pages of baptisms for the enslaved population. And they're pretty clear. It'll say, for instance, Caesar belonging to Governor Fauquier, Jaca belonging to Colonel Custis, and then you know it's a slave person. Many of the African Virginian folks were baptized by the church. but always with their owner's permission. Many slave owners didn't care about their enslaved workers' spiritual lives or actively resisted Christianization of slaves for fear it would make them proud and harder to manage. In 1760, the Associates of Dr. Bray, which is an Anglican missionary society named for Dr. Thomas Bray, who had been very active in the Church of England organizations, which included the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel in Foreign Parts and the Society for the Christian Knowledge, left quite an estate. His goal was that there would be schools set up for the Africans and perhaps the Indians. There were a number of Bray schools set up in the colonies, and one of the most successful was here in Williamsburg. In 1760, the Reverend Dawson, who was rector here at our church, was involved in getting the school organized, along with William Hunter, the local printer. Both soon died, and Robert Carter Nicholas was the main trustee of the local Bray School after that, and he worked with the current rectors of Bruton. Robert Carter Nicholas, who was a very conservative gentleman, very high church, very spiritual, very powerful, is going to be one of the trustees. And so between them, they put together the school. The curriculum was sent from England. The books were sent from England, mostly religious tracts, and then some simple primers with a moral lesson as the children learned to read. They needed to hire a school mistress. Because they were going to have both boys and girls, they decided that having a woman as the teacher made sense because she could teach the girls the domestic side of life. Mrs. Ann Wager was the school mistress for the entire run of the school in Williamsburg, which was 1760 through 1774. She had formerly been a tutor for the Burrell children out at Carter's Grove and had 12 white students in Williamsburg prior to the Bray School. Most of these students are going to be younger, up to age 10. Some as young, probably as 5 or 6. Some a little bit older. The masters were in some cases skeptical about educating too much, that perhaps they would not focus on their work if they were too educated. There were some people eventually who thought that it was not a good thing to teach the Africans to read and write, because then they could read too much for themselves. But in the Bray School, they were taught to read and write, to cast some numbers. They were taught the Lord's Prayer, the Apostles' Creed, the Ten Commandments, and the Anglican Catechism. And when you look in the prayer book, that's quite a chunk of things to learn. These children were furnished with prayer books and Bibles so that they could study. And there are a couple of descriptions of Mrs. Wager bringing them to the church and having them in a classroom situation so that they do learn how to behave. When they could repeat the catechism for Bruton's rector correctly, they received a prayer book of their own. Now they also learn good deportment so that they can fit the place in the puzzle of society to which they have been born, so that their behavior is correct. There are some of them who don't stay in the school very long because their owners want to get them back to work. And by a certain age, they generally want to start getting their investment back. It is a business. And so it becomes a matter of, why does this person need to know any more? Or does this person need to know any more? Eventually, Mrs. Wager gets very sick. She had been a very skilled and very popular teacher. She had taught the Burrell children out at Carter's Grove, so she had real good credentials as far as her experience. And she did a good job with these children for the 14 years that she was with them. In 74, she got sick and died, and she was not replaced. I think between the revolution coming and all the other things they had going on, they simply had other things to do. And there was a little bit of conversation about actually getting the money raised to pay another school mistress. So for the 14 years that it was here, it did great things. There were other Bray schools in other cities. In what I've been able to find, the Williamsburg School was by far a successful one. And it was a good idea. The number of people in other colonies were involved in it too. This isn't just a Virginia initiative. It is all over the place. But it was successful for the time that it was here. And it does show a fulfillment of the idea of educating and baptizing and catechizing all people, you know, which is going to hark to, at some point there's going to be public education. At some point you're not going to have to be very rich in order to be educated or go to school. These are all steps in the process, and the Bray School was a very big step. It's an exciting piece of it too, because it is so contrary to most people's general picture of what the enslaved community was like. Carter's Grove is the plantation just a few miles outside Williamsburg on land originally owned by Robert King Carter. The plantation house was built by Carter's son-in-law, Nathaniel Burrell, home of the Burrell family, which is B-U-R-W-E-L-L. Carter Burrell and Nathaniel Burrell were part of a very prominent, wealthy family. When you're in that select circle of genteel plantation owners, it is quite often the norm to hire a teacher for your own children. Many Anglican clergy did it. Many Presbyterian clergy did it. Many people who needed a way to get to the New World will indenture themselves as a teacher to get over here so they can get a fresh start. And there were frequently little schools set up in a parish and run that way. Sometimes the clergy ran the schools, sometimes they were taught by other people. And the dancing masters would go from plantation to plantation teaching the children. We have Philip Vickers Fithian's diary while he was working at one of the plantations of Robert Carter III at Nominee Hall in Westmoreland County. And he gives a wonderful, complete picture of what life was like in his diary and letters, which were edited and published in the 20th century and are still in print. He had everything from little tiny ones on up to the big teenagers in what was like a one-room school situation. Boys and girls in the same room but taught different things. He has to teach them everything from their basic ABCs all the way up to what they knew about the stars and the planets. It all comes under his purview. So Mrs. Wager, when she taught the children at Carter's Grove, I would say it was probably the same kind of a situation. And that is where the estate of, I want to say Robert Boyle, the chemist, he believed that the missionary effort, again, we needed to convert the Native Americans and teach them so that they are civilized. Back to that quote, bringing out of darkness. The Brafferton was set up to be an Indian school. It had a great initiative. It had a great goal. And one of the chiefs thought it made much more sense for us to give them our boys and they would make men out of them. And that's a very well-known, very famous reference. So when you take these Native children and they have to wear English clothes and eat English food and live in an English house, I'm sure it had its challenges. There were any number of attempts to do this with the natives. Governor Spotswood had his Indian school out at the Fort Christiana, but there were attempts to have Indian schools other places too. The church is always the guardian of education and the keeper of what we think of as social statistics. Birth, death, and marriage registers for the parish was the only official record of life passages. It's the social welfare arm and it's the community. It's all of it, literally in the hands of the church. And people were pretty clearly delineated by their status. And we did find a number of children or young people referred to as mulatto. So they were a mixture of a white parent and an African parent. We also found a number of references to free Negroes. This tells us that though half of society in Williamsburg was enslaved and half of society was white and not enslaved, there is a third little group of free blacks. A law passed in 1667 in Virginia stated that a person's free or slave status was determined at birth by the free or slave status of their mothers at that moment. It did not matter whether the child's father was free or enslaved. Thus, many free blacks in 18th century Virginia and in Williamsburg were born of unions between white mothers and black fathers. If the white woman was a servant, then her mixed-race child was a servant until he or she reached the age of 21. Remember also that between 1723 and 1782, the only way for a slave owner to free a slave was to petition the governor of Virginia and his council, describing some meritorious service as the reason for wishing to free the enslaved person. About 24 people gained their freedom in this way. In 1782, the General Assembly passed another law allowing owners to free their slaves by a legal document, such as a will, a deed of manumission, all recorded in court. Free black Matthew Ashby, who was born of a white mother and a black father, purchased his wife and 2 children from their owner in 1769. But at that point, his wife and children became Matthew's slaves. He next had to petition the governor and council to be allowed to free them. They approved the petition, and Matthew's family was then free. We know the identities of the free few blacks who lived in Williamsburg. They lived in a white society that viewed them with suspicion as possibly sheltering runaway slaves or fomenting rebellion. On the other hand, they had more mobility than slaves, but they could not hold public office or vote. They often had relatives who were enslaved and were subject to some of the restrictions. And they did benefit from the church just like everybody else. You know, the church is the church, and it permeated every bit of your life 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, no matter who you were. The church was the constant that kept everything together. When you unravel the church, you tend to unravel society. And that's one of the things that's very interesting when you get a little further down the road, when the statute for religious freedom is on the table and disestablishing the Church of England is a possibility. And some people are saying, who's going to feed the poor? Who's going to feed the babies born out of wedlock? Who's going to keep society together? Who's going to beat the bounds so that we know who owns what land? Well, if we're saying that they can be Methodist or they can be Baptist or they can be Quaker, then do we expect each of those denominations to pay for their own people, which was one of the options? Or, as Mr. Henry said, should we have a general assessment so that everybody pays a portion and there are benefits for everybody? Or do we expect people to take care of themselves? Do we not want a safety net? In the years of putting together the country, these are things they have to try to figure out. Just how are we going to do all the things the church used to do? Mr. Jefferson's statute is freedom of religion, not freedom from religion. And that one little word can be terribly misunderstood. He never said, throw away your Bible. He never said, stop saying your prayers. He said, no one church has the power over all the others, and Congress shall make no law respecting religion or its practice. So it is the establishment clause that we have to guard against, not faith communities. You know, we don't want one church to have all the power, which is the way they all grew up in Virginia. Now, they didn't grow up that way in Pennsylvania. They didn't grow up that way in New York. But in Virginia and South Carolina, one church has all the power. And it takes a long time for these others, that Great Awakening, when it comes, it just is huge. But it takes a long time for that to have its effect. As the American Revolution is gathering steam, the natives in many places do get a role. Frequently they're scouts, frequently they are helping us get supplies. There are stories from a lot of the colonies about just how valuable they were to the patriot cause. And I'm sure that the natives in every village and in every tribe were trying to do the best they could for their families, but you can see that as we get closer to revolution, maybe sending their children off to a strange town isn't what they're going to do. So the last student actually comes into the Brafferton by 75, and by 79 the school has closed. There's so much that follows in the wake of revolution. When you march off to war, and there's generally a chaplain marching with you, reading prayers for God's guidance on the Army, no matter what army. It's so evident in the American Civil War, but it happened in the Revolution too. The guns are there, the drums are beating, the flags are waving, the adrenaline is pumping. But in the wake of that is all that's left over after battle, after war. And it looks so pretty when you're marching off to war, but when you come back, there's a lot to be cleaned up, and there's a lot that changes. We know that now from our society right this minute. But you think about the Revolutionary period, those armies needed food and shoes and jackets and guns and blankets, and they needed a reason to keep fighting. But in the end, they got done with it and they came home, and then they had to clean up whatever was left behind. It seems to me that after many wars, there is some sort of a recession economically where things dip so far until you get back on an even keel. So that's what's left over after a war too. And the church is always right there to try to pick up the pieces with everybody else. And when church is on top, state gets crushed. When state is on top, church gets crushed. When you do this, you lose the opportunity for balance. When they do this, it's balanced.